He came through the nursery door with 2 guards at his back, and Frost still clinging to his cloak, and he came to put her out into the snow. Senna heard the latch before she heard his step, and by then it was already too late to stand, too late to arrange herself into whatever shape a king expected of the woman the council had set over his sons. She did not stand. She could not. 2 small weights lay curled against her chest, fur damp with sleep, breathing in the soft double rhythm of pups who had finally, after 3 nights of fever, stopped fighting for air. The Alpha King of Hollowmere stopped in the doorway as if he had walked into a wall. His mouth had been open already. Around the words he had practiced the whole ride home, the ones that ended with her name and the gate. The words did not come. His sons, Wick with his charcoal coat, and Tam with the white sock on one paw, lay sound asleep on the chest of the woman he had ridden 11 days through the dark of midwinter to remove. Nobody in that nursery moved for the length of 3 long breaths. Then the Alpha King of Hollowmere, who had not lowered his voice for any living soul in a year, lowered it now, and what came out of him was not the order Senna had braced to hear. That moment will not be explained yet. To understand it, the listener has to go back to the cold the pups were born into, and to the woman who was never meant to be the one holding them. If a story like this one tends to settle in the chest the way it settled in hers, there is a small comfort in saying so before it goes on. It will. It was the year 1142, the dead heart of the northern winter, and the bone moon was 11 nights from rising over Hollowmere. The keep sat black against a white valley, its watchfires small and stubborn under a sky the color of old iron, and in its lowest hall, the new healer knelt at a wash basin scrubbing blood from under her fingernails that was not, for once, her own. She had arrived 3 months earlier in the back of a grain cart, hired sight unseen by a council desperate for anyone who still remembered how to read a fever, and she had known within a week that desperate was the only reason anyone had let her past the gate. Hollowmere did not open its arms to outsiders. It barely opened them to its own. 11 years before that winter, in a keep 200 miles south whose name she had stopped saying aloud, a fever had swept through the pup wing in a single terrible month, and when it was over, the pack had needed someone to blame more than it needed to understand. Her mother had been the keep's healer. Her father had ground the tinctures. When the council there finished its inquiry, it did not matter that the fever had come on the wind from a trading caravan, or that her mother had burned her own hands black, trying to save children who were not hers to save. It mattered that a healer's family had buried 4 pups and lived. The word the council used was poison. The word the crowd used, once it had a word, was simpler. Poison blood. Her parents were put to the road in winter with nothing but the clothes on their backs, their names struck from every registry south of the river, and within 2 years both of them were dead of cold. They had no pack left to shelter them from. Senna had been 13. She had spent the 11 years since learning the only trade she knew how to carry without a name, moving from hire to hire, healing pups who were never hers to claim, until a letter reached her in a border town offering coin for a healer willing to come north and ask no questions about why the last one had died. She had not asked. She needed the coin, and Hollowmere needed someone who would not flinch from sons whose mother had been 10 months in the ground. The road between had taught her things no healer's apprenticeship ever could. It taught her to read a town's welcome in the set of its innkeeper's shoulders before she had said a single word. It taught her which villages would pay a stranger fairly for curing a wasting cough, and which ones would wait until the cough was cured to remember, suddenly, that they did not trust the hands that had cured it. She had slept in barns and in the backs of healers' wagons not her own, had eaten more meals standing at a half-open door than seated at any table, and had learned to keep her satchel packed at all times, because a healer who could leave by morning was a healer who survived the nights other people decided all at once to be afraid of her. The Luna of Hollowmere, Isolt, had died in the first hard frost of last winter, wasted thin in a matter of weeks after the pups were born, her wolf gone quiet days before her heart followed it. The keep still spoke of her in hushed, careful tones, the way people speak of weather that might still turn. Her sons had been left to wet nurses and frightened maids until the council, with the Alpha King still away putting down a border raid that had conveniently flared the same season his mate sickened, had hired a stranger to keep two motherless pups alive through a Hollowmere winter. Senna had taken one look at Wick and Tam, small and underweight, and crying themselves hoarse in a nursery too cold for infants who had not yet learned to hold their wolf shape through a chill. And she had moved her own bedroll into the room beside their cradle without being asked. Mab found her there on the second night, hauling in an extra brazier she had no business carrying alone at her age, gray hair escaping its kerchief, hands raw and cracked from 40 years of the laundry troughs. "You'll ruin your back doing that," the old woman said, and took the other end of the brazier without waiting to be thanked. "I'm told I'm not worth much else around here," Senna said. Mab snorted, a sound with no patience in it for self-pity. "I've served 3 alphas in this keep, girl. I know which smiles to trust and which ones are sharpening something behind their teeth. Yours isn't one I'd worry about." It was the first kindness anyone in Hollowmere had offered her without being paid for it, and Senna had carried the weight of it for 3 months the way she carried the emberroot drops sewn into the hem of her underdress, a habit her mother had taught her before the fever, before the road. "A healer accused once is a healer suspected forever," her mother used to say. So a healer keeps her medicine close enough to prove what it is, and far enough that no one thinks to look. Mab became, in those first weeks, the closest thing to a map Senna had of the keep. She learned from the old woman which corridors the council favored for whispering, which servants could be trusted to carry a message and which could not, and where the kitchens kept the last of the autumn honey for pups who would not take their tonics any other way. Mab had buried 2 husbands and outlived a Luna she still would not speak of without lowering her voice, and she carried Hollowmere's history the way other women carried keys, a whole ring of it, ready at her hip. She had not expected to need it so soon, or to need it for the Alpha King's own blood. The first time she felt the weight of him in a room, she was not in the room with him at all. She was 3 corridors away, elbow deep in a basin of water gone pink with Tam's blood after a fall against the cradle rail, and the air itself seemed to change before she heard a single footstep. The hall outside went quiet in a way no order had caused. A maid froze mid-stride with a tray still balanced on her arm. Somewhere above, a hound stopped baying. "He's home," Mab said, low, from the doorway, and her face did something complicated, relief and dread, both at once. Senna did not see him that night. She heard him instead, a voice traveling up through the stone from the hall below, pitched low and even and utterly without warmth, asking the council in 9 words why his sons had been left to a stranger's hands. She did not learn until the next morning, when she woke with both pups silent and sleeping against her ribs for the first peaceful night either of them had managed since their mother died, that the Alpha King had spent that same night standing in the nursery doorway and saying nothing at all. The named mocker of Hollowmere wore gray robes and a chain of office heavy enough that it seemed to bow his thin shoulders forward, and his name was Os Varin, eldest of the council and regent in all but title for the year the Alpha King had sworn away his own judgment. He found Senna in the herb store 3 days into Roan's return, counting jars of feverfew by lamplight, and he stood in the doorway the way men stand when they intend to be noticed standing there. "The healer line south of the river," he said, as if continuing a conversation only he had been having. "I remember the name now. Poison blood. They called your mother's people, did they not?" Strange, the council never thought to ask before they let poison blood tend the only heirs this pack has left. She did not flinch, because flinching was a thing she had spent 11 years learning not to do in front of men like him. "My mother healed children," she said. "The fever killed them. Those are different facts, and you know it. Or you would not need to say poison twice in one sentence to make them sound the same." Varen's smile did not reach the rest of his face. "We shall see what the Alpha thinks, once he has had time to remember what outsiders cost this pack." He left before she could answer, which she understood, even then, was not a retreat. It was a man setting a clock he did not intend to let her hear ticking. She told herself it did not matter. She told herself the same thing 3 nights later, when Tam's fever returned harder than before, his small chest hitching in a rhythm she recognized from 100 sick beds and feared in a way none of those beds had ever made her feel, because this time the failure would not simply break her own heart. It would hand Osvaren exactly the proof he wanted. She worked through the night with willow bark and steam and the low, murmured words her mother used to sing over fevers that had no name, grinding the bark to powder against the stone mortar Mab had found her, testing the steam's heat against her own wrist before she let it near Tam's small face, packing cool cloths along his throat when the fever spiked and warm ones when the shivering started in its place. Her knees ached from kneeling on the stone floor by the time the worst of it passed. Her hands had gone raw from washing them so often between each small task, the way her mother had drilled into her before she was old enough to understand why it mattered. Near dawn, when Tam's breathing finally eased and his small ribs stopped fighting for every pull of air, she allowed herself 30 seconds of relief before the door opened behind her, and she understood, from the silence, that she was no longer alone in the room. The Alpha King of Hollowmere stood in the doorway, in a black coat still dusted with road frost, watching her with an expression she could not yet read, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. "You should be asleep," he said finally. His voice was a low rasp, the voice of a man who used as few words as the world would let him get away with. "So should they," she said, nodding at the cradle, and only realized after the words left her mouth that she had just corrected the Alpha King of Hollowmere as though he were any tired father standing too late at a doorway. He did not order her flogged for it. He did not order anything. He crossed the room instead, slow, careful, the way a man moves around something he does not yet trust himself near, and looked down at his sons for a long moment before he spoke again. "He has your color in his face now instead of gray," he said, "of Tam," and there was something in his voice that had no business belonging to a king who had supposedly come home to remove her. "That is the willow bark, my lord, not my color." "It is both," he said, and left before she could decide whether that had been an order or a confession. She did not sleep again that night, and not because of the pups. The cracks did not stop after that. She learned to collect them the way Mab collected the keep's gossip, quietly, without comment, certain that naming them aloud would make them vanish. The Alpha King, who was supposed to want her gone, began arriving in the nursery at hours no king had reason to keep, standing just inside the door as though the threshold itself were a wall he had not yet earned the right to cross. He corrected the guard captain sharply once for speaking too loudly near a sleeping cradle, then looked for half a heartbeat, as though he regretted being seen to care that much about a healer's hours. He never once gave the order Osvaren was waiting for. If you would like to know how a man like that finally stops pretending, the comment box below this story tends to fill up with people who already know the answer and still want to watch it happen again. Stay through to the end. It is worth it. The second crack came on a night the wind howled hard enough to rattle the shutters, when Senna found him standing alone over the cradle with one scarred hand resting, feather light, against Wick's small back. And he did not hear her enter until she was 3 steps into the room. He withdrew the hand as though the cradle rail had burned him. "I did not mean to wake them," he said, which was not what she had asked, and was not, she understood, entirely what he meant. "You didn't," she said. He sleeps best when someone's hand is near. So does Tam. They've slept against my chest most nights since you've been home, because the cradle alone never settles either of them. And I did not think to ask permission for that, my lord, so I am asking now. Something shifted in his face, brief and unguarded, gone before she could name it. Keep doing it, he said. Whatever keeps them breathing easy. I do not care whose chest it is. The lie in that last sentence sat between them long enough that both of them heard it. It was not the last time she caught him in a lie that small. 3 days later, she found him in the kitchen yard at an hour no king had cause to be there, splitting wood with his coat thrown over a fence post and his sleeves pushed back. And when she asked, carefully, why the Alpha of Hollowmere was doing a servant's work before breakfast, he told her the cold helped him think. She did not believe that either, not when he had spent the whole hour in clear view of the nursery window, and not when he found a reason to carry the split wood inside himself rather than send a servant for it, lingering in the doorway of the very room he claimed not to be drawn toward. She felt the warmth of him then, the way she had not let herself feel anything in 11 years, a pull low in her chest that had no name she trusted, her pulse loud in her own ears in the quiet room, the particular awareness of how close his shoulder stood to hers, close enough that she could feel the heat coming off him in the cold nursery air. She told herself it was only the fire behind him. She told herself that for 3 more days, the way she had told herself a great many things to survive being 13 and nameless on a frozen road. It was Mab who finally said what Senna would not let herself think. He hasn't stood that close to anyone since Isolt, the old woman said one evening, working a stain out of a healer's apron with more force than the stain required. Not the council. Not Lady Iset, for all her trying. You. Senna's hands went still over the bandages she was rolling. That means nothing. He is grateful for his son's health. That's all it is. Mab's look said she did not believe a word of it, and did not push, because some truths a person has to walk into on their own. Lady Iset was the daughter of a border lord whose lands marched against Thornwood, and she had spent the autumn making her intentions toward the Alpha King plain enough that even the kitchen staff had stopped pretending not to notice. She wore green the way other women wore armor, always some new shade of it, always cut to be noticed from across a hall, and she had a habit of arriving wherever Roan happened to be standing within moments of his arrival there, as though she kept a guard posted somewhere to warn her. She found Senna in the corridor outside the nursery one gray afternoon, dark green skirts sweeping the stone, and looked at her the way a woman looks at something she has already decided to step over. The pups are recovering nicely, she said. A pity their healer won't be needed much longer. Once I am Luna here, poison blood will not be trusted near this nursery again, whatever the council's desperation talked them into this winter. Senna held the woman's gaze and did not look away first. I serve the pups, my lady, not the throne. When you are Luna, you may decide that for yourself. Until then, they are my charge, and I intend to keep them breathing. It was a small refusal, and it cost her nothing she could see at the time. She would understand later how much it had cost. What she did not yet understand, on the night she pressed her ear briefly to a council door she should have walked past, was that Osvaren's hands were not as clean as his robes. She had gone looking for Mab near the old storeroom behind the council chamber, and what she heard through the warped door was not meant for any ears but the 2 men inside it. The stone there held the cold worse than anywhere else in the keep, and she remembered standing very still against it, her own breath loud in her ears, certain that the smallest movement would betray her presence through the gap beneath the door. Varen's voice, low and certain, speaking of a shipment from the river traders, Ashbane root, he called it, enough to keep 2 pups thin and fevered through the spring without a healer alive who would know to look past simple winter sickness for the cause. A second voice, younger, asked nervously what would happen when the healer noticed. She already suspects nothing, Varen said. And if she begins to, who will believe poison blood over the word of this council? We have used that word on her kind before. It worked the first time. Senna did not move for a long moment after the voices faded into other business, her back pressed to cold stone, her own mother's road rising up cold and clear behind her eyes. She thought of Iseult, wasted thin in a matter of weeks, the same autumn Varan had first taken the regency. She thought of a poison with no obvious signature, and a healer already marked as the convenient explanation should anyone start asking why two pups born healthy kept circling back toward death. She told Roan that same night, in the low hour when the keep slept, and the nursery held only the three of them and the banked fire. He listened without interrupting, his jaw tight, his hands closed into fists at his sides that did not open again until she had finished. "You're certain of the word he used?" he said. "Ashbane." "Certain, my lord. And certain it was meant for the pup's tonics, not for any sickness that comes naturally." He was quiet for a long time, staring at his sleeping sons, and when he finally spoke, his voice had gone rough in a way that had nothing to do with cold. "Isolt's wasting came the same season Varin first took the regent's seat," he said. "I never let myself ask why a healthy woman's wolf went quiet in a matter of weeks. I told myself grief did that to people. I told myself a great many things that winter, because believing my own mate had been murdered under my own roof was harder than believing in bad luck. I'm sorry," she said, "because there was nothing else true enough to offer him." He looked at her then, really looked, in a way that made the careful distance between them feel suddenly very thin. "I swore a pact after she died. 1 year of mourning, capital judgment ceded entirely to the council, so no one could say grief had made me a tyrant. Varan wrote half that vow's language himself. I thought I was honoring my mate. I think now I was handing a wolf the keys to the den. If you break that vow before you have proof," she said, "the council will call it exactly what he wants them to call it." "Then I will need proof," he said. And for the first time since he had come home to remove her, he reached out and laid his scarred hand briefly over hers where it rested on the cradle rail, warm and certain and gone again before either of them could decide what it meant. "I want you safe more than I want this throne clean," he said, low, rough, unplanned. I did not expect to mean that about a woman I rode home intending to put out the gate. Neither of them moved to close the small distance the moment had opened between them. They stood instead in the quiet, breath caught, the air between them charged with something neither had yet earned the right to name, and Senna understood, with her pulse loud and her hands still beneath his, that whatever came next would cost them both more than either was ready to pay. That readiness did not arrive in time. 4 nights before the bone moon, Tam went down hard and fast, his small body convulsing in the cradle in a way no fever Senna had ever treated behaved, and by the time she had him breathing steady again, her satchel lay open on the floor where she had dropped it, herbs scattered, the very vials of emberroot and feverfew she carried to save him spread across the boards for any eye that wished to misread them. Osvaran's eye found them within the hour. He stood in the nursery doorway with 2 guards and the full weight of the council behind him, his gray robes catching the firelight, his chain of office gleaming where it pulled his shoulders forward, and he looked at the scattered vials, at the pup still pale and trembling against Senna's shoulder. And he said the word he had been saving for 3 months. "Poison blood," he said, loud enough for the corridor to hear. Loud enough that Lady Isette, arriving a moment later with her skirts gathered and her face arranged into careful concern, did not even need to add her own voice to the accusation, though she did, softly, as though it pained her. "We did try to warn the council. Some blood does not change, whatever desperation hires it. The council did not need much convincing." 11 years of a name struck from every registry south of the river had taught Senna exactly how fast a hall could turn, and this one turned in less than an hour, the old law of Hollowmere recited aloud by Varen's own steady voice. The penalty for poisoning the Alpha Line stated plainly enough that no one in the chamber pretended not to understand it. Exile beyond the gates at the rising of the bone moon, bound and left for the cold to finish what the council would not dirty its own hands doing. Roan stood at the front of that hall in a silence that frightened her more than any shouting could have, his hands fisted, his jaw a hard line, and when he finally spoke, it was not the word she had hoped for. "The vow holds until the year is out," he said, each word dragged out of him like a tooth. "I cannot overturn a capital judgment, not without breaking an oath sworn before this whole pack." What he did not say, what she only understood much later from the careful way Dre would not meet her eyes that evening, was that he had spent the hour after that hall emptied with his fists driven so hard against the council chamber's stone wall that he split the skin over both knuckles and did not seem to feel it at all. "Then break it," she wanted to say, and did not, because she understood, watching him, that something in him was breaking already, slow and silent, and that whatever came next would not come from her asking. They took her to the gate cell 2 nights before the bone moon, a narrow stone room with one high window and a door barred from the outside, and it was Mab who came to her there, slipping past a guard too tired to argue with an old laundress carrying a basket of mending. "I should have spoken sooner," the old woman said, her voice cracking in a way Senna had never heard from her. "I saw him near the herb stores the autumn Isolt sickened. More than once. I told myself it was nothing, because who questions a council elder counting his own jars? I was wrong to stay quiet. I am not staying quiet now." She left before the guard returned, and Senna spent the next 2 days not knowing whether an old woman's memory would be enough to outweigh a healer with poison already in her own family's name, said twice now in this very keep, once at her arrival, and once in this very sentencing hall. On the night before the bone moon, Captain Dre came to the cell alone, his face grim, a battered leather ledger under one arm. "Mab led me to a locked chest in the regent's old chambers," he said. "It took us most of the night to break it open honestly enough that no one could call it planted. Every purchase of ashbane root for the last 14 months is written here in Varen's own hand, alongside the names of 2 river traders willing, with the Alpha's seal promised against their own necks, to swear who paid for it. It will not matter if I am already past the gate by the time anyone reads it," she said. "It will matter to him," Dre said, and did not explain further before he left. The bone moon rose pale and full over Hollowmere on a night cold enough to crack stone, and the gate yard filled with the whole pack summoned to witness the old law carried out. Osvarin at the front of it in his heaviest robes, Lady Isit beside him with an expression that did not quite manage to hide its satisfaction, the visiting Alpha of Thornwood, Corin, watching from the dais with the cool, assessing eyes of a man who had come north expecting to see whether Hollowmere's young king could hold his own throne. Torches lined the yard wall in long rows, their light too thin to do more than carve faces out of the dark, and the assembled pack stood in tight, silent clusters with their breath rising white above them. Senna recognized servants who had brought her tea on quiet nights, guards who had nodded to her in passing corridors, and not one of them met her eyes now. Fear had a way of teaching even kind people to look at their own boots. Senna stood at the gate's edge in nothing but a healer's plain dress, hands bound, the cold already biting through wool, and Tam's small cradle had been carried out at Varen's order to stand at the foot of the dais, a final cruelty dressed up as ceremony. Proof, he said to the gathered hall, that even now the poisoner's medicine could be kept far from the pup it had sickened. 11 years no pack had claimed her by name. She thought of that. Standing there, the cold, pulling tears she refused to let fall, 11 years of being a stranger in every hall she had ever healed in. 12 council seats sat behind Osverin on that dais, and within the hour every one of them would be empty of the silence they had kept for 14 months. Tam began to fail before the moon had fully cleared the wall, his small chest hitching in the cold the way it had hitched 4 nights earlier, his cries thin and frightened from the cradle. No one but Senna seemed to understand, was killing him faster than any gate ever could. "Let me reach him," she said to the guard nearest her, to anyone who would listen. "1 drop, that is all I need. If you still mean to put me past the gate after, I will not fight you." It was Roan's voice that answered, and it came from behind the whole gathered hall, from the broken hinge of the side gate he had torn open with his own hands, rather than wait for any guard to unbar it, frost shattering off the iron in a shower that caught the moonlight like falling glass. The yard went silent. Even the wind, which had been cutting hard across the wall all evening, seemed to drop for the length of that silence, as though Hollowmere itself had stopped to see what its king would do. He crossed it in long strides, Dre and a dozen of his own elite guard fanning out behind him, with the ledger held high enough for the whole hall to see. And he did not stop until he stood between Senna and the gate, between his son's failing cradle and the council that had ordered her bound. "Cut her hands free," he said, and when the nearest guard hesitated, looking to Varan instead of his king, Roan's voice dropped into something that made every wolf in that yard, weak or strong, want to bare its throat. "I said free her." The guard obeyed. Senna did not wait for permission twice. She crossed to the cradle, knelt in the frozen mud in her thin dress, and pressed the ember root drop from the vial still sewn into her hem between Tam's lips with hands that did not shake, though everything else in her did. The hall held its breath with her. One long, unbearable silence broken only by the small pup's ragged, fighting cough. His breathing eased. Color came back into his small face. Somewhere behind her, she heard Wick, carried out by Mab against the old woman's own better judgment, give a single sharp bark of relief at his brother's recovery, and the sound cracked something open in the watching crowd that had been sealed shut for 14 months. Roan turned to the dais. "Osverin," he said, and his voice carried to every corner of that yard without rising once. "You poisoned my mate. You have spent 14 months poisoning my sons, and you nearly let this pack put an innocent woman to the cold to cover it. Captain Dre holds your own hand's record of it, and 2 traitors waiting to swear to your seal." Varen's composure cracked for the first time since Senna had met him, his face going the color of old ash. "Lies," he started. "My lord, this council acted in good faith. The evidence against her was clear. Poison blood does not simply—" He did not finish the sentence. Roan crossed the last distance between them in 3 strides, and whatever Varan meant to say next was lost in the silence of a king's hand closing around a regent's throat, in the brief, terrible struggle that ended with Varan face down in the frozen mud of the gate yard he had meant to bury a healer in, and did not rise from again. Lady Isset's scream was the only sound in the yard for a long moment after. "She knew," Roan said, not raising his voice, not needing to. "She has known since autumn. Strip her of her father's standing and put her on the road her family's gold has never once had to walk. Let her learn what poison blood means when it is not a lie." The guards took her without ceremony, her protests thinning into the cold, the way Senna's own families had once thinned, 11 years and 200 miles away. Roan turned back, and the whole gate yard turned with him, council and pack, and the watching Alpha of Thornwood all together. And what happened next happened slowly enough that every soul present would carry the memory of it for the rest of their lives. He knelt. The Alpha King of Hollowmere went down on one knee in the frozen mud before a healer with no packmark to her name, his sons cradled safe between them, and the 12 council elders who had voted her death not an hour before went down with him, one by one, until every knee in that yard but Senna's own had bent. Alpha Corin of Thornwood was the last to kneel, and when he did it slowly, deliberately, so that no one watching could mistake it for anything but a neighboring power choosing to witness and accept what Hollowmere had just become. "She has been my Luna since the night my sons chose her chest over my throne," Roan said. Into the silence his sons had broken open, "and I will not pretend otherwise for one more hour of any vow." No one in that yard moved to disagree with him. For a long moment after, nobody spoke at all. The bone moon hung pale and full above the broken gate. The cold held its breath the way the whole pack was holding it, and Senna knelt in the frozen mud with one pup recovering against her chest and the other reaching small, frightened paws toward her from Mab's arms, and understood, for the first time in 11 years, that she was not going to be put back on any road. The weeks that followed moved the way a held breath finally moves once it remembers how. The council seats that had voted her exile were filled with names the pack actually trusted. Captain Dre among them, and the old law that had nearly killed her was struck from Hollomere's books before the first thaw. Wick and Tam grew strong and loud through the rest of that winter, their fevers gone for good once the Ashbane stores were burned in the same yard that had once held a gate cell, and they took, both of them, to falling asleep against Senna's chest at the smallest excuse, a habit neither their father nor the keep's new healer showed any sign of wanting to break. Mab kept her place at the laundry troughs, though Senna noticed she worked fewer hours and complained about it considerably less, and on the morning of the spring claiming, when the whole pack gathered once more in the very hall that had once watched a healer accused, it was Mab's raw, steady hands that helped braid Senna's hair before the ceremony, muttering the whole while about young people and their nerves. Roan gave up nothing of his crown that day, but he gave up, before the whole assembled hall, every excuse he had ever made for not naming what stood in front of him. He took Senna's hand in his scarred one, called her his Luna before pack and council and the watching eyes of Thornwood, and did not once look toward the door the way a man looks when some part of him still expects to be told he cannot have the thing he has chosen. That night, with the hall finally quiet and the new fire banked low in the nursery, Senna sat where she had sat on her first night in Hollowmere, two small weights curled warm and breathing against her chest, except now there was no latch to fear. No king coming through that door with words he meant to use against her. Roan came through it anyway, the way he had every night for months, and crossed the room without a sound to settle beside her, his shoulder warm against hers, his hand finding hers in the dark over the heads of their sleeping sons. He stayed there long after both pups had gone fully limp with sleep, neither of them in any hurry to move, the fire burning low and steady against the cold beyond the shutters. And for once, the silence between them held nothing unspoken in it at all. A husband's place did not need announcing twice. Hollowmere's gate stood open through that whole spring, mended where he had torn it. The iron hinge he had broken left unfixed on purpose, a small scarred reminder of the night it had given way for her. The pups slept on. Warm against the chest, no council and no cold had managed to take them from, and outside the window the last of the bone moon's pale light gave way, at last, to morning.